I'm Tony Russo, and this is a bonus episode of Funeral Service Insider. We'll be speaking with Barclay Cadet of Carriage Services, who will be giving a presentation called The Evolution of Talent Recruitment at the upcoming Kates-Boylston Advances in Funeral Innovations Conference, November 12th and 13th in Houston, Texas. What I've really liked doing these bonus episodes over the last couple weeks is the opportunity to take these brief deep dives into legitimate topics. I mean, this is in support of a conference we're having, but the conference we're having is going to have a lot of good information at it. And to get a taste of it and to get like a side view of the presentation in advance has turned out to give us some great audio. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with Barclay. Before we get to the conversation, though, I do want to ask you to consider subscribing to this podcast feed. We have a semi-monthly podcast called Funeral Service Insider, and that's every other Monday comes out. And then we have a weekly In Case You Missed It, which is an audio and video podcast where we round up the week's news in funeral service. And that means talking about different local stories that don't necessarily warrant deep dive coverage in Funeral Service Insider, the newsletter. Anyway, we're proud of both shows and we would love it if you listen to them. But as long as you're listening now, let's go ahead and get started with this conversation with Barclay Cadet. So you'll be joining us in Houston. We're really excited that it's coming up. And now as we record, it's October 29th. So it'll be just a week from now and change, 2 weeks. We'll be out there with you guys in Texas. And your title of your talk is The Evolution of Talent Recruitment. So how did you come up with the idea for this talk?
No, absolutely. I mean, just like with everything else, recruitment, talent acquisition has evolved. Similar to everything else, if you don't change, you get stuck in the mud and you get left behind. Think of Toys R Us, right? Think of how they weren't able to adapt to the changing times. And I think it's important for us to be able to adapt and change. There's quite a bit that goes into that. And, hopefully, I can definitely convey that in my presentation.
Now, one of the difficulties of recruitment is it's almost like recruiting people is like almost like arranged marriage. Like, you check off three things and you're like, okay, well, you're with us forever now. We hope, right, until something goes horribly wrong.
Absolutely.
So how do you kind of hedge your bets when you're doing that?
So it's a combination of things, right? It's understanding people. And I think that's what it all boils down to. If I meet someone at a bar or at a wedding or whatever it is, they'll ask me what I do. I said, I'm in the business of people, right? And yes, you do have the skill sets that the manager is looking for. You do have what looks great on paper, but there's also the nuances. It's understanding the nuances, understanding people, being able to paint that picture and really hone in on how this person would be able to be an asset to the organization. That's what it really all boils down to. It's not surface level anymore because I think, with a lot of different things that are changing, not only in our industry, but also in the job market, you really have to kind of dig a little bit deeper. So you're not in a situation where you're looking to fill this person or this position again in the next 3 months or 6 months, right? You're looking at it as a long-term engagement. And
a big part of that is making sure they fit into the culture, not just that they can do the job. Like anyone who you interview technically could do the job. So, are there ways to convey, when someone's out of work or when someone's looking for a change, I know that they're more excited to get the job than you might be to fill the position. And so it can be, I think, difficult to communicate not the downsides to the job, but the cultural things that people have to learn to fit in somehow.
And I think it's important to level set as well, right? I think early on in my recruitment career, it was a situation where I was just super excited to put someone forward, super excited to fill a vacancy or a requisition or a position, however you call it at your organization.
Right.
But I think as time goes on, you recognize it goes way beyond that, right? And it's identifying those individuals who aren't working, which is totally fine. You don't necessarily look at them in any different light because they're out of work at the moment. But really understanding their motivations and being able to manage their expectations, but sell the opportunity, but not oversell the opportunity, if that makes sense. Because you always want to be honest and be transparent about everything. Because the last thing you want is the person to come back to you 3 months later or 6 months later, especially as an internal recruiter, like, this is not what the job is. This is not what you told me, etc. Right.
Yeah.
So it's being honest, it's being transparent. And I believe being an internal recruiter, you definitely get individuals who like the fact that you're open and transparent, because historically, recruiters don't necessarily have the best rap for being open and honest and transparent. So it's a breath of fresh air for candidates when they hear that.
Yeah, it's funny when I have been between jobs, I've always been nervous. Like I didn't apply to get this job. I didn't apply through a recruiter because
Mm-hmm.
that was always my thing. I'm like, if I sign up with a recruiter, then he's not interested so much in getting me satisfied. He's interested in getting me off his plate and moving on
Right.
to the next guy.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be very difficult, especially for people looking to move around in funeral service, because again, it's such a permanent position.
Mm-hmm.
So when looking to fill a position, do you think it's best for them to do it internally, or are there upsides for getting recruitment? Where do you?
I think it's for me, and especially within funeral services, because we're in the people business. I think you genuinely need someone who understands the culture. I think you alluded to it earlier. If you do have like an agency that you work with quite a bit and they understand the ins and outs of your business, then I can understand it. If you don't have the internal resources to do so, but I think the internal route, or establishing that internal talent acquisition team that understands the population of individuals that you're working with on a daily basis, that understands the culture of the company, that particular location, it goes a long way, where we're able to kind of point out things and red flags. I like to call them amber flags as well. And so you can kind of convey that to the manager, because again, the candidates that you're putting forward, they're not a number, they're an actual person. That's how we kind of look at it and as an internal recruiter. And that goes a long way with finding the right person for a position internally.
So are there like general amber flags, or does it have to do with the specific position?
Sometimes it depends on a specific position, but one thing I like to hone in on is motivations, right? Like, what are you looking for? What genuinely makes you happy? What makes you get up and come to work in the morning? And, if someone's also looking to leave, I kind of hone into as to the why, right? That's something that's super important as well. If someone says something like, well, my manager asks too much of me, or the workload is too much, right? Then, I'll kind of dig into that a little bit and understand the why behind that. Because it might be a situation where the location that I'm looking to place them at has a very similar, it's probably a heavy call volume, right? So it's just nuances and little things like that you hope to extract in that initial qualification call.
And so the title being the evolution, what are some of the significant changes, let's say in the last decade, in the way that you can go about or ought to go about recruiting people?
Mindset. It's mindset. It's navigating artificial intelligence. It's identifying the difference between a great resume / profile that, was professionally created or created by AI and versus an actual good profile, right? So it's just using some of the tools at your disposal as well. Everything from social media to partnering with schools and universities, not just in the area, but across the country, to ultimately bridge that gap. Because, what I'm finding is that there is a little bit of a gap between kind of like the seasoned funeral professionals that we have currently and also the newer mortuary professionals that are being introduced to the industry. And it's, kind of being that bridge, that gap between the two. And again, I think that, once we kind of can infuse some of that new talent, we'll be able to kind of have an influx of new ideas, of diversity of thought. And ultimately, this is the future of our industry.
You mentioned navigating AI. How has that changed it feels like almost like looking for a job is almost like looking for something on the internet in general, where it's like you have to know how to game the system just to survive in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how, as an employer, can you kind of sort that through?
That's a great question. I think that sometimes you go with your gut. If it looks to be too good to be true, chances are it is, right? We have something called ChatGPT nowadays that, you can type in a particular job title and it'll spit out a perfectly written resume for you. Sometimes you can spot it right away. in someone's resume has little to do with their formatting and more so to do with, what they actually put on their resume. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the person that used an AI generated resume can't do the job. It just means that you just really want to question around it. And I think within funeral services, it's a little bit more kind of black and white where, if they've been a funeral director elsewhere, that they've probably touched on a lot of this stuff. It's just digging into the details.
So I started writing about funeral service and they're like, can you write? And I'm like, I guess. I mean, I had to, they knew that I would have a learning curve.
Right.
But you expect that there's going to be a smaller learning curve if you're hiring a funeral director, and it's more going to be like an integration thing, like what can we do to make you a good part of this team?
Yeah, and it'll vary from location to location, depending on what that location or community needs, right? It'll vary. So it just really goes back to what I mentioned earlier. It's understanding, that particular group, that particular location, and, going from there.
What do you hope people will take away most from your talk? What do you hope people will say, all right, when I get back to my place, I'm going to start doing this? Also, there are going to be a number of students there. What do you think the students will say about, okay, this is what I have to know recruiters are looking for?
Well, the first part, going into any type of engagement with a talent acquisition professional, a resume that's presented with an open mind. Because I think that a lot of the times, like you said, funeral services might not necessarily be an industry or a location that's hiring often. So they're not necessarily looking at resumes or hiring as often. So, things change, right? I'd say after COVID and before COVID, we can use that as a little bit of a timestamp. The way you look at resumes are different now than when we looked at them prior. Prior, you would look at a resume and say, oh, this person has 2 jobs in 3 years. They might not necessarily be a viable option. But post-COVID, there's a lot of things that have happened, a lot of mergers, acquisitions, companies closing out, people switching professions, places being impacted by COVID. That's contributed to it. And you just want to kind of go into it with an open mind and not necessarily look at what's on paper, but try to see what's going on with the person internally. That will go a long way. And to answer the second part of your question from students' perspective, a former manager told me to speak to everyone that works here. And he said to take the meat and leave the bone. And what he kind of meant by that is you take a little bit from every interaction that you make. You take a little bit from every conference, every meeting, every conversation that you have, and then you'll be able to kind of start to formulate what you would need to do in order to be successful. And I think one thing that's super important is the utmost level of professionalism. You might not necessarily think of it that way, but when you're viewing families, someone's coming to your location is probably having the worst day of their life. They want someone that's able to connect, someone who's professional, someone who'll be able to understand. And I think that's something that they would be able to kind of take away from these types of engagements as well.
That was Barclay Cadet. And one more time, you can check the show notes and come to the conference. It is November 12th and 13th in Houston, Texas. Events.Kates-Boylston.com, or check the link in the show notes. And that is all for this time. Make sure you subscribe wherever you're listening now so that you can catch our In Case You Missed It, which is our weekly funeral service news show, and Funeral Service Insider, which comes out every other Monday. Have a great Halloween, and we will see you in Houston.